Hello and welcome to the special business meeting of the District of Squamish. Today is Tuesday, May the 2nd, 2023. And as always, we're gathered to do our work on the traditional territory of the Squamish Nation. Please be advised that this council meeting is being live streamed, recorded, and will be available to the public to view on the District of Squamish website following the meeting. If you have concerns, please notify the corporate officer present at the meeting. Could I have someone move adoption of the agenda, please? Councillor French, seconded by Councillor Stoner. All in favor? Motion carries. And just so those, Councillor Greenlaw is joining us online today. Thank you, Councillor Greenlaw. Good to see you. And we're moving on to item 3 is staff reports. And I'll turn it over to staff to introduce themselves on the topic.
Good morning, Mayor, members of council. My name is Roland Russell. I'm a senior financial analyst here at the District of Squamish. I will be sharing a presentation with you shortly. So I wanted to start our discussion today by discussing assessed value of property by class. There is a chart in your report towards the end of the report, which shows a comparison of the change in average property assessment for various classes. What I should point out is that these values are based on the average change in average assessed value year by year, and they are cumulative, but they are not compounded. Okay, and so in real life, the actual numbers will be compounded, so the total increase will be higher than what is shown here. I also want to point out that you can see that light industry have been trailing the other groupings that are depicted here for residential and business over this time frame from 2015 onward until 2021, and then it jumped up in the last 2 years. That significant jump in the last 2 years is related specifically to properties owned by BC Rail in the business park that are light industry, and as a result of other transactions, not necessarily those lands, the light industrial lands have been revalued and the assessments have gone up significantly. And the significant increases are basically around a few specific properties owned by BC Rail. So although you see a really big jump, please keep in mind that that is pretty much all related to one property owner. Okay, so we wanted to provide that as context to provide some background as to where our assessments have changed over the years and a comparison of the various classes. So with that, we'll continue on. So this chart that you see here, this is a comparison of tax impacts of various property classes. This is done with no change in tax ratios. This is provided as a benchmark. This is the status quo. Is using the tax ratios that are currently in effect today. So 2022 tax ratios. And as you can see, they depict a sliding scale of increases from approximately 1% for average residential up to 22.6% for business. Okay, I'll move on to the next slide. And on this slide, again, this is the same information without with no changes in the ratios, and this just shows a comparison of the various tax ratio values. So you can see that residential is 1 and business is 2.57, and the associated tax rates have been calculated on those bases. The one thing that I want to point out here, so that it's clear for members of council and the public, is the column tax burden, percentage of burden. It should be noted that the residential tax burden is 62.5%, and the business tax burden is 26.8%. So combined, those two classes make up 89+% of the total tax that we receive. So approximately 90% is generated between residential and business. So as a result of that, to have any significant impact changing of ratios, one needs to change the business ratio. If we don't change the business ratio, we don't really have much impact on the overall burden, who's paying the tax. Okay, so just to keep that in mind as we move forward and we show you the scenarios that were requested by council. In this scenario, this relates to council. Sorry, my hands are a little faster than I thought. This is council resolution, and the council resolution was to set the ratio for business in such a way that the average increase would be 16%. That resulted in a business class ratio of 2.37. To adjust the light industry ratio such that the overall increase in average tax would be 20%, and that resulted in a 3.41 tax multiplier. You can't see those values right now because they're on the next slide. But what we wanted to point out on this slide is that by making those changes, the residential impact has increased by 2.6%. So on the previous slide, similar to this, it was a 1.2% increase in average residential. And with the changes that were requested per the council resolution, the number is now 3.8%. And that makes sense when one takes into consideration that there's a 2.6% change, or 2.6 times a 1% change. That's appropriate because the business multiplier is 2.57. So as a result of the multiplier, we're seeing a significant change in residential where, one might have anticipated a smaller amount. There's a batch of other statistics I can grind out to you, but they're all in the report, so I'm not going to reread this. We talk about percentage changes from one class to the next and dollar amount increases, etc. What I did want to point out, because I think that is important with respect to this, is this chart and looking at the ratios and the tax burden as a result of them. So on this chart, you'll see that the business multiplier is 2.37 and the light industry multiplier is 3.41. We're seeing an increase in the residential tax burden from 62.5 to 64.2, and a reduction in the business tax burden to 25.4. The total burden shared amongst these two classes is 89.5. So the overall burden between residential and business does not change dramatically. There is a slight shift more towards residential and a little less towards business. So at this point, those are the ratios, those are the ratios that resulted in the percentage increases that council wished to take a look at from the resolution standpoint. So I want to pause at this point, and I'm going to just jump back for a split second to our previous slide here with the status quo. What I wanted to point out on this slide is we're at 2.57 for business and 3.82 for light industry. We have a policy which staff adhere to, which is to ensure that our ratios are set such a level that they promote business and that they are competitive for light industry. We are below the BC average for both of these numbers currently, which is why from a staff standpoint, we're comfortable that we're within the range, policy range that the council has recommended. And so we're putting this to council to provide further direction as to whether they would like us to maintain the existing ratios or whether they would like to see the revised ratios as per council resolution, or if there's further discussion that they would like to take place. So at this point, I'm going to pause and turn it back to the mayor for continued discussion from council.
Thank you very much. I have Councillor Pettingill.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I just want to make sure I understand the situation with the BC Rail properties, where it seems that's where there's a significant increase in value. Now, did that drive a general increase in all the other light industrial property values, or is it just that this small collection of BC Rail properties skewed the average? And so it's the average in those properties that shifted, but most other light industrial assessments did not significantly shift.
I would say the average was skewed by the dramatic increase in the valuation of the BC Rail properties, rather than all of the properties went up by, this is showing 25 or 30%. It is more the average was driven up by the dramatic increase in the cost of those specific properties. Within the light industry class, there's approximately 75 properties. So it's a pretty small sample size, and a significant change in valuation can have a dramatic impact on the average.
Council, other questions? Go ahead, Councillor Hamilton.
Thanks very much for the presentation. Yeah, I was the one that suggested the 16 and 20% changes a couple of weeks ago. I had done a very rough estimate, thinking that would increase the residential rates by approximately 1%. I obviously did something wrong in my quick mental math. Not surprising. Taxes are not a simple thing. Is there any time to try another combination of rates and see the result?
Through the mayor? Yes, there is. We had somewhat anticipated that your request was for a 1% increase in residential. So we took the liberty of calculating out what the tax ratios would need to look like for that to be the general result. So if you'll bear with me, I will show you those numbers at this point. What's it doing? Sorry. Oh, sorry. I need to. Okay, now he walked out. If you'll just bear with me for a moment, I'll get
While staff is sorting that out, I want to thank staff for the report that we got and coming to this meeting anticipating that this is where we might go. We have a great staff, and this is an example of just how great our staff is. So they're not even hearing it because they're so focused on getting this available to us.
Thank you, Councillor French. I would agree. Well, let's cover this ground again when they're more focused on receiving it as well.
Thank you very much, Mayor, members of council. I'm obviously better with numbers than technology, for a Tuesday morning anyway. So to address the question raised by Councillor Hamilton, we've attempted to increase the average residential tax dollar amount by 1%. That results in a business ratio of 2.5 and a light industry ratio of 3.5. As a result of those two numbers, we're seeing an average increase in business of 20% and an increase in light industry of 22%. Again, as I said, we're showing a 1% increase in average residential. So if we No, I'm not. Oh, sorry. My apologies. I managed to have turned our slideshow off again. So
Sorry. Share. And then right screen. Okay, and then hit from current slide. Slideshow. Current slide. Okay, is that the right slide?
yes, it is. Let's try this again. My apologies. So this was the slide I was supposed to start on, I think. So anyway, this scenario was created to answer the question of what would a 1% increase in residential look like. What we're seeing here is a 2.2% increase in average residential. Single family moves from negative to positive. Strata goes up by approximately 1%. Light industry comes down from 33 and business drops from 22.5 or 6 to 20.5. So we're seeing a reduction in the ratios for light industry. We're seeing a reduction in the ratios for business. That results in an increase in the amount that would be paid by single family residential, or actually all residential. And those are the new ratios which would generate these values. So I guess at this point I will pause again and I will try to push the slideshow in the correct direction this time so that we're back at the question slide.
So I have a speakers list and I have Councillor Stoner on that list, but Councillor Hamilton sort of instigated this questioning. So we will go in this direction for now. And Councillor Stoner, did you want something on this quite yet? Or are you okay if we go sort of discuss this point before we get to yours?
My only request is if we could pull up the slide with the ratios again for the third scenario presented.
Okay. And this, okay, thank you. And then Councillor Hamilton?
Thank you for preempting what I might have asked. Yeah, I don't have any questions about this right now. I'm just going to take a moment to digest.
Thank you. Councillor French, did I see your hand on this? Yeah, go ahead.
So my question is this new scenario that we're seeing now for the first time, does it fit within the policy directive that it has been guiding you on this?
Yes, it does. Through the chair. Yes. Both, we've reduced the ratios for light industry and business. The ratios were already below the BC average, which was the target of the policy. So now they're a little further below the average, let's say.
Okay, great. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Pettingill.
So I'm not sure if you're able to answer this, but we've heard that the increase in business is largely actually an increase to BC Rail properties and not business as a whole. Oh, sorry. Right. Light industry as a whole. Do we know, are there lease agreements and so on such that if we were to do something to change the rates, those rates would flow through to the businesses, or might BC Rail sort of hold on to any benefit?
I'm not prepared to speculate on what an individual business may do with any savings that they receive through an adjustment in tax ratios, because I don't know. And I truthfully, the same would go for other businesses. If their properties were leased, let's say, would they pass those along? I don't know. And I'm not prepared to speculate.
I have a question around the percentage of burden. I find this to be a really interesting area, and it goes to sort of the available tax base and how we distribute, and the ratios are accomplishing that. And I see a lot of areas here, a lot of categories where we don't really have those. We don't really have those categories to lean on. So when we look at the where as you rightly pointed out, where the bulk of our tax base is, we are with this already have an above average percentage of burden on the residential aspect. And how I'm having a hard time finding like the BC average. The taxation is so complex. I'm trying to understand the average in this particular column, because it feeds into land use planning to achieve a wider tax base and like all these types of concepts. Can can you, in the other areas, we've been able to sort of discuss that our ratios, how that fits the BC average, that makes sense. But really, I think besides driving at the dollars and cents of what someone's tax bill is, it's this percentage of burden is really what we're discussing. What's the sort of range in the BC average? Do you have any information on that? I'm just trying to figure out how. I mean, the middle of the road is a good place to have, but like how far, because our ratios in some cases are half of the BC average, but the burden we're much closer. But do they have the same sort of range in overall between the extremes? Do you follow my question? And it's okay to say no. I'll try to rephrase.
Through the mayor. Yes, I follow your question. Unfortunately, I don't have that data in front of me. It's something that we have because we've been provided the necessary data with the BC averages, etc. But without scouting through that data and trying to look at what the overall ranges are, I can't answer that question at this point. I would suggest that the range is, how should I put it? The range is narrow but broad. So I know that sounds crazy, but what I guess what I'm trying to say is there's going to be some really big outliers which would pull the average one way or the other. But if we were to look at a group of similar municipalities, and I say this because I've run those calculations in the past, then the range is fairly stable and fairly similar. The fact that we are well below percentage of assessment versus the burden isn't really surprising. I mean, that's what happens when you're primarily a residential community. If you don't have significant industrial base or business base, then you're going to have a fairly high incidence of taxation against the residential. So what I would suggest this is telling us is that business is pretty much where you would expect, but we're a little higher on the residential side because we're a little lower on the industry side. So without going any further or digging into the data more, that's the best I can say at this point.
No, thank you. That's helpful. I just seeing that we're less than half or approximately half in some cases in the tax rate, but the resulting percentage of burden is actually remarkably close to the average. Really, I was having a hard time reconciling too, but that's helpful. Go ahead, Councillor Stoner.
Thank you, through the chair. I'm wondering if staff can speak a little bit to kind of the historic nature of setting tax rates and the importance of tax ratios to try and maintain some form of consistency. One of the challenges is that you then multiply the tax rate by the assessed value, and we have no control over that assessed value. But I know on the residential side in the past, we've kind of seen the impact of the changes of the assessed value shift between neighborhoods. So last year it was downtown that increased substantially. The year before that it was Brackendale. And unfortunately, there's just some areas of town that get hit harder, but it tends to circulate. My sense this year, as I read the change in the market growth, is that impact is being felt on the business and light industry side more so than perhaps on the residential side than what we've seen in previous years. Is that a fair assessment at this point?
Yes, that is.
Thank you.
Councillor Penningill.
I hope this isn't too far off topic, but we do have the ability to do a business improvement district and do a sort of a tax incentive that way. But sort of seeing with BC Rail, they are leveraging a fair amount of the lands for a laydown yard for a fossil fuel facility, which I would argue is not in line with some of our economic development aspirations. Is it appropriate, depending on your perspective, to sort of contemplate, let's leave that ratio high, understanding that's where the bulk of the assessment increase is, And, you know, in conversation with BC Rail, it's sort of say, hey, if we're more aligned, we can look at the taxes again in the following years. But this year, you know, why wouldn't we want to maintain a high level of light industrial, or not a high, maintain the industrial tax, especially given that the primary driver of the increase is arguably not aligned with some of our economic development goals? Or is that sort of offside to think about incentives in economic direction when setting rates?
Through the mayor, totally above board on this. That's a political decision, not a staff recommendation decision, whether you want to increase or decrease a specific group, adjusting their ratios accordingly. So I'll leave that to the people on that side of the room, if you don't mind.
Thank you. Yes, Councillor Stoner on this point.
Yeah, through the chair, just a comment on that. I think it's really challenging given how broad some of these cases are that we actually don't have that nuanced variability. There are 71 portfolios or folios under the light industry. So yes, it's being driven by some changes in the BC Rail valuation, but your decision impacts every single one of those folios to a varying degree. And we don't have, I don't think, around this table, the visibility into each of the impact that it would have on each of those particular folios. So I just want council to be cognizant that it's really difficult to drive political motivations through tax burdens at this level.
Thank you for that perspective, Councillor Stoner. Yeah, go ahead, Councillor French, and then go back to Councillor Penigo.
Okay, thanks, Mayor. And fully on board with what I just heard from Councillor Stoner, and would like to add that I believe what Councillor Pettingill is suggesting could potentially result in our forest industry, our forest sector being collateral damage in that move. So yes, the fossil fuel industry would see increased burden. So would our forest sector at a time that I think is not prepared to handle that.
Thank you. Councillor Penigo?
Yeah, and just to be clear, at this point, I wasn't contemplating an increase. I was sort of, in my mind, I guess, justifying leaving the rate sort of with the averages in line with our policy and understanding the majority, where the majority of any impact is, as opposed to suggesting a change. It's more pulling me away from trying to undercut, in particular, the light industrial rate at this point.
Thank you. Councillor Stoner, then Hamilton.
I was going to move a motion, so unless Councillor Hamilton or others have questions, I'll wait.
Okay, Councillor Hamilton.
So the increase in the light industrial average, you said, was dominated by the increase in the assessed value of one particular property owned by BC Rails. Do you know the reason? Do we understand the reason for the increase in assessed value? Was it a change in zoning, or was it sort of just BC assessment somehow catching up?
I don't know whether there was a change in zoning. The lands appear to have been in the same assessment class from 21 until now, so over the last 2 years. But we're looking at a 60 or 70% increase in the value of those specific properties. It's very dramatic. And so I might hazard a guess, although I'm not an assessor, that over the past 2 years, in comparison, when they're doing the assessment, they're comparing the values of properties today to other properties that may have sold that are in the same class. So I think that there's probably some impact of other property sales in the light industry class that is pushing up the overall valuation on a per acre or per hectare basis. And so using those new numbers, they've reevaluated the properties that BC Rail owned.
Councillor French.
Thanks, Mayor. And so just ahead of Councillor Stoner letting us know she's got a recommendation. I'd like to know, in the staff recommendation in section 7, we have the alternate recommendation, and it calls for numbers to be dropped into the recommendation for class 5 light industry and class 6 business. So my question is, if we were to take the numbers that we're seeing in the newly created, we've dubbed scenario 3, and drop them into this alternate recommendation, what would be the numbers that go into those 2 blank spaces?
Through the chair, the numbers that go into the 2 blank spaces would be 2.5 for business, class 6, and 3.5 for light industry, class 5.
Thanks for that clarification.
Seeing no other, Councillor Stoner?
I was going to move the staff recommendation that we maintain the current proposed tax ratios for the 2023 District of Squamish tax rate bylaw. And if it's seconded, I'll speak to it.
Councillor Pettingill, are you seconding? Councillor Pettingill seconds. Go ahead, Councillor Stoner.
Thank you. Through the chair, thanks to my colleagues for bringing up this in-depth and detailed review of our tax rates. I think it's really important to do on an annual basis to really dig into the numbers. And thanks to staff for being so prepared with the different scenarios and presenting them so clearly. Tax rates are really challenging. They are not as straightforward as we would like them to be. And we don't have as many levers, I think, given the broad tax classes that we have, to set the tax rates as we would like them to be able to create the nuances in the business scenarios, in the residential scenarios, in allocating our taxes as fairly as I think some of us around this table would like to. So I think it is always a challenge. I do think that we have fairly strong policy in this area that directs us really to focus on the ratios that we've established and the percentage of burden, not so much the overall increase of tax that you'll see once it's multiplied by the assessed value. I think when we start to focus on the overall percentage increase on a year-to-year basis, we end up kind of going all over the place, or we risk to, because that percentage of assessed value really does change on so many different factors that we don't have control over. What we have control over is the ratio and the percent of burden. And I think both of those values to me remain consistent year over year, which I think is important. And they remain competitive, especially for light industry and business. And those are the 2 factors to me that are the most important. And the reality that unfortunately this year we're seeing a higher drive of the percentage of property value being impacted or impacting the business and light industry rates. But there are other sectors of our tax classes that have felt that impact in past years. So I think this is a bit of a speed bump, and it will move on to another tax class in forthcoming years. So I feel confident and comfortable with where we've landed with the staff recommendation to maintain our tax ratios this year. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Stoner. Councillor French.
Thanks, Mayor. And Mr. Russell, while you were focused on technology, I took the opportunity to point out that I really appreciated the work that you and your team put into the report that Council asked for 2 weeks ago to get a better handle on what shifting the burden could look like. I found it to be a very helpful document. I had to read it a few times to really understand what it was trying to tell me, because I'm not a math guy. Councillor Hamilton 2 weeks ago was able to do some mental math that I couldn't even contemplate doing. And I was thankful at that time that we were able to at least land on some percentages that we could direct staff to come back to us with an idea. And I was hoping that the report would deliver what you ultimately came to us with scenario 3. So I'm really appreciative of all the work that staff put into this, because you really delivered what I needed to be able to speak intelligently, hopefully, on this topic. And I struggled a bit this weekend to share all of this with people who are interested in the impacts of our decision today. And while maybe I didn't convey your work well to others, I think I'm pretty clear in my head of exactly where we're at and where we're going. I was half hoping we might land on an alternate motion in this meeting, but having heard everything that I've heard and hearing Councillor Stoner talk to us about how important it is to be consistent with these rates, I'm finding myself completely agreeing. That consistency is important, and it's going to drive my support for the motion that's in front of us now.
Thank you, Councillor French. I have Councillor Greenlaw and then Anderson.
Thank you, Mayor. Councillor Greenlaw is at home with laryngitis, so she has sent me, asked me to be her voice in the meeting. Speaking in favor of the motion, relative to the rest of the province, we are very much still playing catch up for light industrial taxes, with our average rate between 1/3 and 1/2 of the provincial average, whereas our residential tax burden is slightly higher than the provincial average. Councillor Greenlaw thinks keeping tax rates as staff originally suggested is appropriate and alleviates further financial burden on the homeowners.
Thank you, Councillor Greenlaw, and Ms. Arthurs for being Councillor Greenlaw's voice. Go ahead, Councillor Anderson.
Thank you. I'll be supporting the current motion. I'm happy to have had this discussion on broader issues of land use planning, for example. Just a couple of comments. The BCR Railway Marshalling Yards, it looks like BC Assessment Authority has finally caught up to them. They've been in transition for a while now, and it is in our vision for those yards is part of this picture of change, manufacturing, evolving towards manufacturing. It reflects the scarcity of these lands, coming back to land use planning, and the market transactions. One of the firms being hit is one of our best employers over 24 years, through 3-4 recessions, have not laid anybody off, kept going all these years. And at this time, is a company struggling to make decisions about making a new investment on this property in a glulam factory after having received 140% lease rate increase. So I think that I'm happy to see how mindful we are of our business community in the present discussion, and I'm supporting the present resolution. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Anderson. Councillor Pettingill.
Thanks. Yeah, I will support this. I guess I'm a little bit torn. I think, as mentioned, given that the light industrial change is driven particularly by one property, and there's no guarantee that savings will be passed on to tenants, and one of the large tenants I think is not aligned with our economic interests at this point, I'm not sure I want to move on that number specifically for all the reasons we discussed. I am concerned about the average, the business class and that increase. And that's one where I might be inclined to try and shift that away. I do sometimes wonder, it's good to see in our policy, and one of the things that's keeping me or allowing me to support this, despite some misgivings, is that we are well below or below or in line with ratios and averages. So we're not out of line, which keeps us competitive with other municipalities. Although we can't lose sight of the fact that our assessments are high here, and so there is a bit more to the story than just the ratios. I guess I do worry that if we keep residential too low relative to business, we do bake in a bit of a bedroom community. And so I'm just a little bit cautious of that. I think, though, again, given the alignment with our policy and looking at the average amounts, I think this is supportable. Again, I do have some concerns about the business piece, and I think maybe this is something to take away to our economic development team. Maybe there is a reason or rationale to consider some business improvement districts along with some of our other policy and economic development goals. That's not a conversation from right now. So I just want to highlight sort of some of my concerns, but overall, I think this is supportable, and I appreciate the work staff has done on this and the analysis to make sure that we are in line with the rest of the province and as painful as it may sometimes be, fair taxation. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Pettingill. Councillor Hamilton.
I reluctantly won't be supporting the motion on the table, not because I don't think I think staff's done an amazing job. This isn't. I do think that we can do. I am concerned about the impact on businesses in this case. I would be interested. Should this motion fail, it may not. I would put forward a motion which saw light industrial maintained at the staff recommendation, and then business tax rates, the business multiplier reduced slightly with residential. Pardon? Thank you. Thank you for your wisdom. And I can do that now, right? Then I would like to propose an amendment that the light industrial, let me try to get the numbers right here, ratio is maintained at 3.82. Do I understand correctly that that was the staff recommendation? Yep. And that the business ratio is put to the scenario 3, 2.5, and that the remainder go to residential.
Councillor Stoner, seconds. Would you like to speak to your amendment?
Thanks very much. I think that the fact that the light industrial tax increases or property assessments were dominated by one property, and the fact that that's such a small cohort of properties in our district, I think that I didn't understand that previously, and now understanding that, I don't think that we should move our overall tax rates because one property has increased in value. And but I'm very concerned about the business tax rate increases, and I think we should do something to try to reduce that burden on business, the business tax increase.
Okay, Council, on the amendment. Go ahead, Councillor Pettingill.
I am inclined to support the amendment. I think I spoke to my rationale earlier, and this seems in line with some of the concerns I raised.
On the amendment, Councillor French.
Thanks, Mayor. I too will be supporting this amendment. It is where I was leaning towards going into this discussion, and I think that it allows a more manageable increase for our commercial and business sector. And yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Councillor Stoner.
I will support the amendment. I think it's a fairly minor amendment, but it does hopefully make some changes for our business community that are tangible. I think my hesitation here is that when we do this, we really can't discern between small businesses and large businesses. We can't discern between businesses that are owned or leased. We can't force property owners to pass on the savings to lessees. We know in past years where we did have an alternate schedule at which we applied during COVID when we deferred the 5% increases. The businesses that took the most advantage of that were our large scale businesses. It wasn't our small businesses. It wasn't passed on to our small businesses. So I think that there is a risk here that we are actually not going to have the impact that we hope in trying to support especially our smaller business community in realizing some of these cost savings. That said, we also know that it is still a really challenging time for our small businesses that are coming out of COVID, but in particular are seeing the COVID benefits that were presented to them from upper levels of government have recently ended. And I know many of them are challenged by that as they try to smooth their way out of that support. So I will support the amendment that Councillor Hamilton has put forward on that rationale, recognizing that it does maintain the light industrial rate as we had expected, and I think it'll have a minimal impact on the shift to the residential component. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Stoner. Other comments? I've appreciated the discussion today and all of staff's work to help us have the best informed discussion that we can on this topic. So thank you for that. The piece that really jumps at me is the percentage of burden for our residential, which is higher. And I think the way to address these issues is with ongoing responsible land use planning so that we have better numbers to work with. And the weird and wonderful ways of BC assessment do rear their head in different ways from year to year. So taking a longer look at the impacts of our rates outside of an annual basis, I think is more appropriate. I think as we adjust to our ratios to mitigate the impacts of the BC assessment fluxes, I think we run a large risk of things getting weirder along the way rather than smoother and having to take some sort of other action in subsequent years. So I'm not going to support the motion or the amended motion at this time for those reasons, but do see that we have a lot of work to do to increase our business base and get our residential percentage of burden down. And that's a goal that I have more broadly, and taking that longer look and reacting to these numbers through continued responsible land use planning is my objective. Thank you. With that, seeing no other hands, I'll call the question on the amendment. All in favor? There we go. And then opposed? Mayor Herford opposes. Amendment carries. So now back to the main motion as amended. I think we've been through this, and with that, I'll call the question. All in favor? And motion carries. Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Council. Next, we're on to our 2022 audited financial statements, and we have staff presenting as well as our auditors online.
All right. So Paul Fripp here with BDO Canada. Just wondering, are we waiting for you, Rianne and Heather, or
Hi, Paul. Yes, yeah, we're just bringing up the presentation.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks. Sorry, can't see the presentation at this point in time.
Great, thank you. Good morning, Mayor and Council. My name is Heather Boxer, General Manager of Financial Services, and my pronouns are she, her, so I can be addressed accordingly. So I'm joined today by Rianne Sousa, Director of Financial Operations, as well as our auditors, from BDO, who are online, Paul Fripp, who is the audit partner, and Zinnia Kubar, our audit manager. And we are here today to present the 2022 financial statements and audit engagement results. So before I pass it over, I just want to extend a big thank you to the finance team and BDO for a successful audit this year. Each year, it is a big undertaking for the team, and each year we have significant efficiency improvements. Specifically, big thank you to Ms. Souza, who led the audit team and the audit this year. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Ms. Souza.
Thank you, Ms. Boxerd. So I'm here today to present on the district's 2022 audited financial statements. The goal of the presentation today is that Council receive and accept the 2022 consolidated financial statements. For Council and the public's background, the Community Charter of BC states that the financial statements must be presented to Council for its acceptance and the financial statements sent to the municipal inspector before May 15th of each year. Further to this, the municipal auditor must report to Council on the audit review of the financial statements. The key elements to highlight are the auditors concluded that the consolidated financial statements present fairly in all material respects the financial position of the district at December 31st, 2022, in accordance with Canadian public sector accounting standards. Consolidated within the district's financial statements are the Squamish Public Library and the Squamish Sustainability Corporation. Also to note, the district's financial statements are within the approved financial plan. Prior to moving into a detailed review of the financial statements, I first want to note that the 2022 financial statements indicate that the district is in good financial health. The net assets of the district are $29.1 million, which is sufficient to meet the district's short and medium-term obligations. I'll now move into the significant variances on the statement of financial position in comparison to the 2021 results. The statement of financial position can be found on page 1 in the financial statements. Cash and cash equivalents have decreased by $5.3 million. The decrease is primarily due to a $7.5 million short-term debt that was issued for Fire Hall 1 in December 2021. Investments have decreased by $3 million. The decrease is primarily due to a $5.3 million GIC maturing, of which $2 million of the proceeds were invested in the MFA mortgage fund. The $3.3 million of GIC proceeds that were not reinvested are now reflected in cash and cash equivalents on the statement of financial position. Accounts receivable has increased by $2.5 million. The increase is primarily due to a grant receivable of $1.5 million for the Jimmy Jimmy Judd project and an increase of $400,000 GST receivable. Development cost charges have decreased by $3.7 million. The decrease is primarily due to the expenditures incurred for the wastewater treatment plant, which are DCC funded. Lastly, debt has decreased by $2.5 million. The full schedule of debt issuances and repayments can be found in the financial statement note number 10. Continuing on with the statement of financial position, tangible capital assets represent the cost of assets less accumulated amortization. There was an 18 million increase in tangible capital assets this year. The 377 million accumulated surplus balance represents a 310 million investment in capital assets, 55 million in reserves, and 12 million in non-statutory reserves. I'll now move into the significant variances in comparison to the financial plan on the statement of operations, which is page 2 in the financial statements. Other property levies revenue is 960,000 greater than the financial plan, primarily due to collecting higher than budgeted hotel tax, a higher than anticipated BC Rail grant in lieu of taxes, and greater than budgeted tax penalties. Other fees and charges revenue is 1.6 million greater than the financial plan, primarily due to collecting greater than budgeted building permit revenue. Government transfers for operating is 1.2 million less than the financial plan due to a number of grant-funded project expenditures being deferred to 2023. Investment income is 1.5 million greater than the financial plan as interest rates increase more rapidly than projected in the budget. Continuing on to the expenses on the consolidated statement of operations, general government expenses are 1 million greater than the financial plan due to the actual amortization being greater than what was budgeted for. Protective services is 1 million less than the financial plan due to RCMP vacancies, RCMP retro pay being less than anticipated, no retro pay for the integrated homicide investigation team, and expenditures funded by the FireSmart grant being lower than expected. Transportation and transit is 400,000 less than the financial plan, primarily due to the transit strike. And health, social, and housing is 290,000 less than the financial plan due to the planned expenditures for the community strengthening grant being deferred to 2023. Continuing on to other on the consolidated statement of operations, government transfers for capital is 7.9 million, lower than the financial plan, primarily due to grant-funded expenditures being deferred to 2023. The major project expenditures deferred to future years are 1.8 million for the Brennan Park revitalization, 3.8 million for the Winaic Park Sea Dike, 600,000 for Mamquam Road, 520,000 for the Adventure Center building upgrade, and 600,000 for the Valley Cliff Child Care Facility. Developer cost charge capital revenues is 6.5 million, lower than the financial plan, due to developer cost charge funded project costs for the water reserve and wastewater treatment plant being incurred slower than anticipated. Development contributed assets and 2.9 million greater than the financial plan due to donations, cash in lieu, and developer contributions not being budgeted for, and only a small amount is budgeted for community amenity contributions. Lastly, you will note that the district has realized a surplus of 17.7 million. The rationale behind this surplus is the legislated calculation for a balanced budget in the financial plan is calculated differently than the annual surplus in the financial statements. The financial plan recognizes sources and uses of funding that's not recognized in the consolidated statement of operations, including capital expenditures, borrowing proceeds, principal repayment on debt, and various transfers to and from reserves and provisions. The financial plan also eliminates amortization on tangible capital assets. Moving to the recommended resolution. The recommended resolution is that the District of Squamish Council receive and accept the 2022 consolidated financial statements as presented by Financial Services on May 2nd, 2023. Thank you for your time. This concludes the presentation, and I will now turn it back over to the chair.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Council. Councillor Pettingill.
Yeah, thanks. A couple things. One, just around developer cost charges. it's a little bit confusing, I think, to understand where the revenue versus expenditures are incurred. And I guess if you sort of look at the slides, you might be left with the impression that we're collecting a lot less developer cost charges, which I don't think is the case. So just make sure I understand that the money we collect, we don't count that as revenue until we actually spend it. So even if we collect a lot of developer cost charges this year, on our accounting books, it says we didn't because we'll show that revenue in a couple of years when we build the project. Is that correct?
Through the chair, yes, that's correct. And you can see the balance of the development cost charges on page 2 or page 1 of the financial statements. In liabilities, the development cost charges that we are currently holding are $19.3 million.
Okay, thank you. And then the other thing on a different topic, and we've touched on it a few times, but with our social procurement policy, have we or will we sort of reevaluate our banking provider and whether now is a time to look at, say, a credit union or something for some of our banking?
Through the chair, at the moment, we aren't looking at bank providers. It's quite an undertaking to change our bank provider. There has been no direction from council to do so. When I say it's quite an initiative, that means a full overhaul of our systems as well as just even the contracts. At this point in time, the value that they provide is quite good.
Thank you, Council. Other questions at this point? Councillor Stone?
Thank you. Through the chair, I'm just trying to find the page that my question relates to, which is on note 10 with respect to debts on page 27. There's a table of the principal repayments on long-term debt required in each of the 5 years and thereafter. And especially on the general government side, the repayment in 2028 plus jumps by $8 million. And I'm just curious if staff can speak to why that is.
Through the chair, the column 2028 plus is all years from 2028 to 2042.
Great. That's fantastic. Thank you. And then under that, there's a line that just says authorized but unissued debt totals. I'm just wondering if staff can speak to what that is and if that is a potential liability or risk on our books.
Through the chair, just for the public's background, for loans, we come to council, or staff brings to council loan authorizations, which are the full debt that's projected for the project. So the authorized but unissued debt is primarily for public works and fire hall number 2. In terms of the risk, if we do not, or if the district does not need to utilize all that debt, the bylaw can be canceled, so it doesn't present a risk to the district.
Wonderful. Thank you. And then there are 2 items in the revenue section that caught my eye, which I had not necessarily seen before. And I'm just wondering if staff can speak to how or where they go. So one is the BC Rail grant in lieu of taxes. And where does that end up? And then the second one is the GST tax rebate and input tax credit that we receive from CRA. And do both of those just go into general government revenues, or how do we account for those in our both our audit but also our financial plan?
Yes. So in terms of through the chair, for the BC Rail grant, it is in the line noted in revenue other property levies. So that's where the BC Rail grant is. In terms of GST receivable, it doesn't actually run through as revenue. It's when it's receivable to the district, it will show in accounts payable. If it's receivable, it shows in accounts receivable on the consolidated statement of financial operations. And then when the receivable is received, it moves into cash.
Sorry. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Thank you through the chair. Just a point of clarification. GST is a flow-through tax, so we don't actually ever earn or expend with GST. So it just flows on through to the federal government.
Thank you. And then can you just speak to the BC Rail tax or cash in lieu of taxes and how that gets added into our financial plan? Where does that end up?
Through the chair, so the any provincial or federal governments, we don't directly tax. They're exempt from taxation, but they do pay cash in lieu. So it becomes a general revenue that goes through the general fund.
Oh, I have Councillor Greenlaw and Ms. Arthurs.
Thank you, Chair. Through the chair, the question is, Councillor Greenlaw is wondering if staff could speak to why some items appear multiple times with different amounts on the general debt sheet. For example, page 25, General Capital Works, Fire Hall number 1, etc.
Through the chair, the reason that some are the descriptor is specifically what it is, and some say general capital works, is the general capital works would have had multiple projects on one loan authorization. So to provide a description would be quite lengthy. So we titled it as general capital works.
If you have a follow-up, Councillor Greenlaw, we can come back. I can see. Okay, great. And any further questions, Council? You're going to move the staff recommendation, Councillor Stoner, second by Councillor French. Would you like to speak to it?
Happy to. I was on a call on Friday, actually for BC Social Procurement Initiative, that had a lot of finance folks from across the province on the call, and they were all celebrating the fact that they had gotten their audits received by their councils. And that's because this is such a huge lift. So our auditors are on the call, but also to our staff, thank you for all the amount of work that goes into creating the consolidated financial statements and providing this visibility to council and to our community. To know that our district is in good financial health and good standing is really, really critical. It's a core part of what we do. And the audit was clear, concise, and thanks for answering all of our questions today.
Thank you, Councillor Stoner. Any other comments on this? Okay, I'll venture my own. I really appreciate this work and this and the external look gives me just that extra layer of confidence in what we're doing here. And often when we're looking at these things, it's during budget, and it just further builds out our understanding as we tackle those those budget pieces going forward. And without a solid health in our financial, then we cannot accomplish the things we need to do. So it's very much core of what we do. And thank you so much for all the work to get us to this point, and to our auditors who are also on the line. So with that, I'll call the question. All in favor? Motion carries unanimously. Thank you so much. Okay, Council, next up, we have a motion to close, which I will move. Second by Councillor Stoner. All in favor? Motion carries. Thank you.